Her groom walked away mid-vows. Then Hell's Angels leader and 500 bikers stormed the ceremony. A small-town bride stands frozen at the altar, humiliated in front of everyone she loves. Cameras flash, whispers rise. Her perfect day shatters in seconds. But just when the world starts laughing, the roar of hundreds of motorcycles fills the air. The church doors burst open. And what happens next changes everything. These men weren't there to crash her wedding. They came to protect her dignity, to stand beside a broken woman who refused to hide. But the moment that turned her into a symbol of courage also made her a target. When the world that mocked her learns the biker leader's dark past, everything spirals again. Now she must decide, hide from the shame or rise from it louder than ever. Because sometimes the angels God sends don't wear halos, they ride Harleys. Would you still believe in love after the world watched yours fall apart? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The morning sun poured through the stained glass windows of the First Baptist Church, coloring the aisles with gentle shades of rose and gold. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. White lilies lined the pews, soft music floated from the organ, and every seat was filled with smiling faces. Emily Grace Saunders stood in the small dressing room at the back of the church, staring at herself in the mirror. Her lace gown shimmered softly in the light. Her heart raced, but it wasn't fear. It was hope. At 38, she had waited her whole life for this moment. After years of quiet heartbreaks and broken engagements, this day was supposed to be her new beginning. Her best friend, Maggie, adjusted the veil over her hair. "You look like a dream, Em," she whispered. "Like every prayer you ever said finally came true." Emily smiled, even though her stomach twisted with nerves. "He's been acting quiet all week," she murmured. "You think he's nervous?" "All men are nervous before vows," Maggie said, giving her a light tap on the arm. "Don't you start doubting now. You got a good one." Emily nodded, trying to believe it. Robert had always seemed sure, confident, steady. He was kind and charming, a real gentleman, or so she thought. When the wedding march began, her father opened the door, his eyes glistening with pride. "You ready, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Emily took his arm. "I've never been more ready." As they stepped into the church, the crowd stood. Murmurs of awe rippled through the room. The organ swelled. Emily's smile trembled as she looked up the aisle at Robert waiting for her. His hair was neatly combed, his suit perfect, his hands clasped in front of him. But his eyes, they looked far away. Step by step, she moved closer until she stood before him. The pastor began the ceremony. Everything sounded distant, just words flowing around her, like water running past rocks. She heard her name, then his. She heard laughter, soft sniffles, the rustle of dresses. And then silence. "Robert?" the pastor prompted gently. "Do you take this woman? Robert's voice broke. His hand trembled in hers. He swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the back doors. "I can't." The room froze. "I'm sorry," he whispered, stepping back. "I can't do this." He turned and walked straight down the aisle. Gasps filled the air. A woman cried out. Someone whispered his name. Emily stood frozen, the echo of his shoes fading away. Her bouquet slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. The organist stopped playing. The pastor tried to speak, but Emily barely heard him. Her vision blurred. She felt her knees weaken, and Maggie rushed forward, holding her steady. Outside, she could see through the glass doors, the man she loved disappearing into the sunlight like a ghost. Someone snapped a photo. The sound of the camera's shutter sliced through the silence. That was when she realized everyone was watching. Her perfect day had become a spectacle. She wanted to scream, to run, to disappear, but her legs felt heavy as stone. Her father reached for her, his old hands trembling. "Come on, honey. Let's get you out of here." Emily shook her head and whispered, "No, not yet." Her lips trembled as she tried to breathe. "He just needs time. Maybe he'll—" Maggie's voice was soft but firm. "He's gone, Em." The words hit her harder than she expected. Emily turned toward the door and walked, her gown brushing the floor like snow melting under sunlight. She pushed open the church doors and stepped outside into the gray afternoon. Rain began to fall, thin, cold drops on her face. She didn't care. Her mascara ran, her veil caught in the wind, and her heart broke in the middle of Main Street, Tennessee. Down the road, the low growl of engines rumbled. She barely noticed it at first. Then it grew louder, closer, a thunder that filled the air. She looked up and saw them, a long line of motorcycles gliding down the hill, chrome gleaming through the drizzle. The sound shook the ground beneath her feet. People on the church steps gasped as the bikes slowed and stopped near the curb. At the front of the line sat a man in a worn leather jacket, silver hair peeking beneath his helmet, eyes calm but piercing. He turned off his engine and climbed down, walking toward her slowly. Emily wiped her tears, embarrassed, but he didn't stare. He just removed his gloves and offered her his jacket. "You look like you could use this more than me," he said gently. She blinked, surprised by the warmth in his tone. "You don't even know me." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But I know what it looks like when someone's world just fell apart." The rain grew heavier. He took off his helmet and looked, back at the row of bikers waiting silently behind him. "You standing here in a dress, crying in the rain? That man's a fool." Emily almost laughed, a small shaky sound through her tears. "You don't know the half of it." He nodded towards the church. "Then let's change the story, ma'am. Don't let them see you break." She followed his gaze, hundreds of eyes still peering through the stained glass. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. The man grinned. "Let's walk back in there. You head held high, we'll walk with you." Her breath caught. "You'd do that?" He shrugged. "Sometimes the Lord sends strangers to help you stand tall." Emily hesitated only a moment before nodding. The man turned and motioned with his hand. The roar of engines returned, low and steady, like thunder rolling in the distance. As she walked beside him up the steps, the church doors swung open again. The entire crowd turned, eyes wide, as she entered. Not broken, but carried by the echo of 500 engines and the kindness of a stranger in leather. The man beside her whispered, "Let's give him something holy to remember." And for the first time that day, Emily lifted her chin and walked without trembling. The next evening slid in slow, hot, and heavy. The Arizona sun had started its long fall toward the horizon, turning the sky the color of orange sherbet. Grace Miller stood behind the counter at Sonny's Diner, refilling sugar jars and wiping down menus. It had been a quiet day. Just a few travelers, a couple of regulars, and the usual gossip from Linda, who worked the morning shift. But even as she hummed along to the old jukebox tune playing in the corner, her mind wasn't on work. It was on him, the man from the highway, the one whose eyes she couldn't forget. Every time the bell over the diner door jingled, Grace glanced up, expecting to see him again, though she didn't know whether she wanted that or not. By 9 o'clock, the dinner crowd had thinned to just a few truckers. The hum of the ceiling fan and the clatter of plates filled the air. Grace poured a fresh pot of coffee and glanced toward the window when the sound hit her. A deep rumble, low and steady, like thunder rolling over the desert. Her breath caught. The door swung open, and there he was. The man from the highway stepped inside, the bell chiming softly behind him. His leather jacket looked dusty from the road, and his boots left faint tracks on the tile. He walked with slow confidence, like someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Grace froze for a second, then quickly set down the coffee pot before she spilled it. He noticed her right away. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, surprise, and something deeper neither of them wanted to name. He walked up to the counter and sat down. "Evening," he said simply. "Evening," she managed. "Coffee?" He nodded. "Black." "Thanks," Grace poured, careful not to let her hands shake. He wrapped his fingers around the mug, the steam fogging his knuckles where tattoos crawled up to his wrist. For a long moment, they didn't say anything. The other customers glanced his way, whispering softly, their eyes flicking between the man and Grace. "You're the lady who stopped for me yesterday," he said finally. She smiled faintly. "Guess I am. Bike doing okay?" "Runs like new." He paused. "Owe you for that." "No, you don't," Grace said quickly. "I told you before, you don't need to pay me." He studied her face for a second longer, then nodded, accepting that. He took a slow sip of coffee, eyes scanning the diner, quiet but alert. When he finally rose to leave, Grace noticed he left a $100 bill under the cup. "Sir, wait," she called, hurrying out from behind the counter. But by the time she reached the door, he was already outside, straddling his motorcycle. The roar filled the night as he turned the key, but before he pulled away, he looked back at her. There was a faint smile beneath his stubble, and he lifted a hand in a small, silent wave. Then he was gone again, swallowed by the desert darkness. Grace stood in the doorway for a long moment, the bill trembling in her hand. When she turned it over, she noticed something written in messy, heavy ink across the edge of the receipt. "You stopped for me. I stop for you." Her heart gave a funny little twist. The next morning, Grace woke up to the sound of church bells. Sunday. She sat at her small kitchen table, sipping weak coffee, thinking about what had happened. Should she tell Linda? Should she tell Pastor Brooks? Or should she keep it to herself? She shook her head. People in this town liked to talk too much, and she wasn't ready to have her name on their tongues again. By the time she reached church, the sun was already high, and the parking lot was full of familiar faces. Linda waved her over. "There you are," Linda whispered as they walked inside. "You won't believe what I heard. Someone said a biker was seen around the diner last night. That true?" Grace hesitated. "Yes, he came by, just for coffee." Linda's eyes widened. "The same man? From the road?" Grace nodded. "Oh, Grace," Linda sighed, half worried, half curious. "People are already talking. You know how this town is." Grace forced a smile. Let them talk. Still, by the end of service, she could feel eyes on her. Mrs. Campbell gave her a tight smile. Deacon Harris wouldn't even look her way. On her drive home, Grace tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. Maybe she was foolish to think that helping a stranger could stay simple. 2 nights later, just before closing, the diner lights flickered under the hum of the old sign. Grace was sweeping when she heard the familiar sound again, the low, steady rumble of a bike pulling in. Her heart leapt, then settled. She didn't even have to look up. He came in quietly and sat at the same stool as before. This time his hair was damp from a long ride, and his eyes looked more tired. Grace walked over with a smile that came easier now. "Coffee again?" He nodded. "You remembered." "Hard to forget someone who leaves $100 tips," she teased lightly. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. "Guess I overdid it." They talked more this time. Little things at first, about the heat, the diner, the broken jukebox. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Why'd you stop that day?" Grace blinked. "Why wouldn't I?" He shrugged. "Most folks don't stop for guys like me." "I don't see a guy like you," she said softly. "I just saw someone who needed help." He didn't say anything for a while. Then he nodded, as if those words meant more than she knew. When he left again, the night air seemed a little quieter, the stars brighter. Grace stood at the window watching his tail light fade into the dark. This time she didn't feel uneasy. She felt something else, something warm and alive, like hope stirring after a long sleep. Still, she couldn't ignore the whispers that had already begun. By morning, word had spread. A Hell's Angel had been seen at Grace's diner again. And just like that, kindness turned into gossip. Grace brushed her hair back, staring at her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. She could already hear Linda's voice in her head, worried and scolding. But she also remembered those blue eyes, tired and human. She set down her brush, squared her shoulders, and whispered to her reflection, "I did what was right." Then she walked out into the rising sun, unaware that the man she'd helped was about to turn her whole life upside down. By Monday morning, the gossip had spread faster than the desert wind. Small towns were like that, quiet on the outside, but buzzing underneath with whispers that traveled from gas stations to church pews, from grocery aisles to beauty shops. When Grace Miller arrived at the diner that morning, she could feel it in the air. Conversation stopped when she walked in. People smiled too quickly. Her boss, Mr. Talbot, avoided her eyes. She tied her apron around her waist, pretending not to notice. But she heard the snippets anyway. "They say he's one of them." She let him sit in her diner again. Hell's Angels, can you imagine? Grace took a deep breath and started the coffee pot. She wasn't going to let a few words shake her faith. Still, as she poured steaming mugs and served pancakes, her heart beat faster with every sidelong glance. Around noon, her friend Linda Parker slid into an empty booth, concern written across her face. "Grace," she said softly, "we need to talk." Grace set down a plate of fries and leaned on the counter. "If this is about that man again—" "It is about that man," Linda interrupted. "Half the church is buzzing. They think you're keeping company with him." Grace frowned. "He's a customer. He had coffee." "I know, but people around here, they remember what happened with that biker gang years ago. Folks got scared back then, and fear doesn't die easy." Grace sighed. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know that, but not everyone sees with your eyes, Grace." The words stung, though Linda meant them kindly. Grace finished wiping the counter, her movements slow and tired. "Let them talk," she said quietly. "I'd rather be kind than right in their eyes." Linda reached out, squeezed her hand, and whispered, "Just be careful." That night, after closing, the diner lights flickered low. Grace stayed behind to count the till, the only sound the ticking wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, thunder grumbled far off in the desert hills. The first fat drops of rain hit the glass as she gathered her things. Then came the sound. A deep, familiar rumble. Steady, powerful, and close. Grace froze. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw the red glow of a motorcycle's tail light pulling into the lot. She hesitated, her heart torn between fear and curiosity. The door opened with a soft jingle, and there he was again. The stranger. His jacket was soaked, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. Rainwater pooled beneath his boots as he stepped inside. "Sorry," he said, voice low. "Didn't mean to come in this late, just needed somewhere dry." Grace swallowed her nerves and nodded. "You can sit wherever you like." He took a stool at the counter. She poured him coffee without asking. The rain drummed harder outside, thunder rolling across the sky. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the rain and the soft hiss of the coffee pot. "You always work this late?" he asked. "Most nights," Grace said. "Helps keep my mind busy." He nodded slowly. "That's a good thing." After a pause, she asked, "You passing through again?" "Trying to," he said. "Road keeps leading me back here." There was something in his tone, tired but gentle. She didn't push. Finally, he looked up at her, blue eyes soft in the dim light. "You ever feel like the world wrote you off too soon?" Grace's throat tightened. "Every day." He smiled, a small, crooked thing. "Yeah, me too." They stayed like that for a while, two lonely souls sitting out a storm, each too proud to admit how much they needed the peace of that small moment. When the rain eased, he stood to leave. "You'll get soaked," Grace said. "Storm's not done yet." He gave a low laugh. "Been through worse." Still, she grabbed a towel from behind the counter and handed it to him. "Then take this. No sense catching a cold." He hesitated, then took it with a quiet, "Thanks." He started toward the door, then paused. "Name's Ryder," he said softly. Grace smiled. "I'm Grace." He nodded once. "Figures." Then he walked out into the rain. The next morning, Grace arrived early to open the diner. The rain had cleared, leaving the desert air smelling like dust and wild sage. But as she reached for the door, she froze. Someone had taken pictures of Ryder's motorcycle from the night before, printed them, and taped them to the window. Scrawled in black marker across the bottom was a single word: shame. Grace's chest tightened. She tore the photos down, crumpled them in her hands, and shoved them deep into the trash. Inside, she leaned against the counter, breathing hard. The coffee machine gurgled in the background. "Lord," she whispered, "why do good things always get turned into bad stories?" Her voice cracked, but she steadied herself. She refused to cry. When the first customers came in, she smiled as if nothing had happened. She served eggs and toast, listened to small talk about the weather, and laughed when she could. But deep down, something had shifted. The kindness she'd shown had come with a cost, and now she knew it. Still, when she looked out the window and saw the desert road stretching far and empty, she felt no regret. Because somewhere out there, a man named Ryder was trying to find his way back to something good. And Grace Miller, quiet, faithful, stubborn Grace, would never believe that kindness was a mistake. By Thursday, Grace could feel the town's eyes on her everywhere she went. At the grocery store, conversations hushed when she walked past. At church, even Pastor Brooks gave her a polite but uneasy nod. She didn't need anyone to say it out loud. She already knew what they were thinking. In their minds, the kind widow had become the woman who kept company with a biker. Grace tried to keep her head up. She worked double shifts at the diner, smiled at every customer, and filled coffee cups even when whispers swirled behind her. But that evening, as she wiped down the counter after the dinner rush, Mr. Talbot, her boss, called her into the office. He looked uncomfortable, twisting his wedding ring around his finger. "Grace, you know I like you," he began. "You're the best server I've had in years." Grace waited, bracing herself. "But," he sighed, "some folks been talking. Couple of our regulars said they won't come in anymore. Said they don't feel safe with that biker hanging around. You understand how that looks?" Grace crossed her arms. "You mean how it looks to them, or how it looks to you?" Mr. Talbot looked down. "I just don't want trouble. Maybe you could tell him not to come back for a while." Grace's heart tightened. "He's never caused trouble. He pays his bill. He's polite." "Grace, please." His tone softened. "I'm trying to keep peace." She nodded slowly, biting back her frustration. "I understand," she said quietly. "Peace." But inside, it didn't feel like peace. It felt like shame. That night, rain clouds gathered again, and lightning flickered over the horizon. Grace closed the diner early, hoping to beat the storm home. As she locked the door, the wind caught her hair and whipped it across her face. Then she heard the sound. That deep, familiar rumble of an engine rolling slow through the parking lot. She turned. Ryder pulled in on his motorcycle, the headlight cutting through the rain. He looked tired, his jacket soaked, his face shadowed beneath the flickering light. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, shutting off the engine. Grace shook her head. "You didn't, just a long day." He glanced toward the locked door. "You closing up early?" "Storm's coming," she said. "And people, well, they've been talking." His jaw tensed. "About me." "About me too," she admitted. "They think you're trouble." He looked away, rain dripping from his hair. "They ain't wrong," he murmured. "I was once." Grace stepped closer. "Were. That's past tense." He met her eyes, those piercing blue eyes that always seemed to carry both strength and sadness. "Past don't stay buried easy, Grace." She felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the weather. "Come inside," she said finally. "You're soaked." "I don't want to make things worse for you." She smiled softly. "You already did, so might as well come in and have coffee." He chuckled under his breath, a low sound that warmed the air. Inside, the diner glowed dimly under the neon light. Rain tapped the windows like soft fingertips. Grace poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him. Ryder sat hunched over the cup, steam rising around his scarred hands. "You ever wonder," he said, "if people can really change?" Grace leaned on the counter. "I think we're all changing all the time. Some just don't notice it." He looked up, a hint of disbelief in his eyes. "You actually believe that?" "I have to," she said. "Otherwise, what's the point?" He smiled faintly. "You sound like my mom." Grace tilted her head. "She a believer?" "Preacher's daughter," he said softly. "She used to say everyone's one prayer away from a second chance." Grace smiled. "Sounds like a wise woman." He stared into his coffee. "She died before she ever saw me get clean." The words hung heavy in the air. Grace didn't say anything. She just rested her hand gently on the counter, close enough for him to see it but not touch. After a long silence, he looked up again. "You think God listens to people like me?" Grace's voice was steady. "He listens harder." When Ryder finally stood to leave, the rain had softened to a drizzle. He pulled on his gloves and said, "You're different, Grace. You look at me like I'm still human." She smiled. "Maybe that's because you are." He nodded once, almost shyly, then stepped outside. As he swung his leg over the bike, the neon light flickered across his vest. The Hell's Angels patch bowled against the wet leather. Grace caught sight of a flash outside. A camera click, maybe, or lightning. She turned her head quickly, but saw nothing but rain. Still, something in her chest told her the storm wasn't over. The next morning, she found out she was right. A folded note sat under the diner door. It wasn't signed. The words were written in red marker. "Keep his kind out, or you'll regret it." Her hands trembled as she held it. For a moment, she thought about throwing it away, pretending she hadn't seen it. But she couldn't ignore what it meant. Someone had seen her. Someone didn't want forgiveness walking through those diner doors. Grace locked the note in the register drawer and started the coffee machine. When Linda arrived for her shift, Grace just said, "Let's make today a good one." Linda gave her a searching look, but didn't press. As the morning light spread across the floor, Grace whispered under her breath, "Lord, give me strength to stand for what's right, even when the world wants wrong." Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance again, and somewhere down that long Arizona highway, a man on a motorcycle was heading straight toward a fight he could no longer run from. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of desert sky that promised heat later, but hid it under clouds for now. Grace Miller was running late again, her old blue pickup sputtering as if it shared her weariness. When she turned the key, the engine coughed once, twice, then died. She groaned softly, resting her forehead on the steering wheel. "Not today," she muttered. She tried again, but the truck only wheezed. After a few minutes of useless tinkering, Grace sighed and climbed out. She popped the hood, pretending she knew what she was doing, and prayed under her breath that it would magically fix itself. It didn't. That's when she heard it, the low rumble of a motorcycle engine slowing on the dirt road behind her. Her heart lifted and sank all at once. "Ryder!" He pulled up beside her, dust swirling around his boots as he parked. His dark hair was wind-blown, and his leather jacket looked freshly cleaned but still worn by miles of road. "Truck giving you trouble?" he asked, hopping off his bike. "Seems that way," Grace said, folding her arms. "Won't start, not even a cough now." He gave a short chuckle. "Mind if I take a look?" Grace hesitated. "I can't pay you, Ryder." "Didn't ask for money." He gave her a half smile. "You helped me. My turn." Something in his voice softened her hesitation. She stepped aside. Ryder rolled up his sleeves and leaned under the hood. His scarred hands moved with practiced ease, checking wires, tapping parts, muttering to himself. Grace watched him quietly, surprised at how gentle his movements were for a man built like stone. After a few minutes, he straightened up. "Loose terminal," he said. "Corroded a bit." "Mind if I clean it up?" Grace handed him a rag. "Go ahead." Within minutes, the engine roared to life. Grace clapped her hands together, grinning like a child. "You fixed it." Ryder wiped his hands on the rag. "Guess I did." She laughed softly. "You're full of surprises, you know that?" "Been told that before." "Let me make you lunch," she said suddenly. "It's the least I can do." He started to protest, but the look on her face stopped him. "All right," he said with a shrug. "Lunch it is." They sat on Grace's small porch overlooking the flat stretch of desert behind her trailer. She'd made vegetable stew with cornbread, simple but hearty. The sun peeked through the clouds, painting the sand in shades of gold. Ryder ate slowly, like a man who hadn't had a home-cooked meal in a long time. "This is real good," he said between bites. "Better than diner food." Grace smiled. "Don't tell Mr. Talbot that," he smirked. "Your secret's safe." For a long while, they ate in comfortable silence. The wind rustled through the mesquite trees, and a hawk circled high above. Finally, Grace said, "You ever get tired of running?" Ryder looked at her, eyes distant. "Every day." "Then why keep doing it?" He hesitated, setting his spoon down. "Because sometimes running feels safer than stopping. When you stop, you have to face what's behind you." Grace nodded slowly. "I know that feeling." He glanced at her, curious. I used to think if I worked hard enough, prayed hard enough, I could outrun the pain of losing my husband, she said quietly. But grief doesn't go away. It just follows slower. Ryder studied her for a moment, something like understanding flickering in his eyes. Guess we both got ghosts chasing us. Maybe so, Grace said softly. But maybe they stop chasing once you turn around to face them. He gave a faint smile. You talk like a preacher. Only on Sundays, she teased. He chuckled, a sound that eased the heaviness between them. That evening, Ryder followed Grace to the diner. The parking lot glowed under the orange sunset. She went inside to start her shift, and when she looked out a few minutes later, she saw him, standing across the street, helmet tucked under his arm, watching. He didn't come in at first, but finally, near closing time, he stepped through the door and sat at the counter. The room grew quiet. Regulars stared. Grace tried to ignore it as she walked over. Coffee? He nodded. Yeah. The sheriff, sitting in a booth nearby, watched them carefully. When he left a few minutes later, he tipped his hat toward Grace but gave Ryder a long, measuring look. After he was gone, Ryder said quietly, Your sheriff doesn't like me much. He doesn't know you yet, Grace said. People fear what they don't understand. Story of my life, he muttered. Grace leaned closer. Give them something new. To see. He smiled faintly. You think I can change a whole town's mind? I think you can change one heart at a time, she said. He studied her for a long moment. You really believe that, don't you? With everything I've got. The next Sunday, something unexpected happened. When Grace walked into church, the congregation whispered as usual, but when she looked to the back pew, she saw him. Ryder, sitting quietly, hat in his hands, eyes lowered. Linda gasped. Grace, she whispered, you didn't. I didn't invite him, Grace said softly. He came on his own. During the sermon, Pastor Brooks spoke about forgiveness, how no one was too far gone. Grace swore she saw him glance at Ryder more than once. After the service, some people avoided him. Others stared. But Grace walked right up, smiled, and said, Glad you came. He nodded. Needed to see what keeps you so steady. It's not me, she said. It's who I lean on. Ryder's lips curved slightly. Maybe I'll try that sometime. As he walked out, a few heads turned. But Grace didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt like faith wasn't just a quiet thing you held. It was something you showed. That night, as she drove home, Grace noticed the sky clear again. Stars spread wide and bright over the desert. Her heart felt light. Ryder had taken one small step toward the light, and she knew this was just the beginning of something bigger than both of them. But far down the road, unseen in the shadows, a single motorcycle light flashed once, then vanished. Someone else was watching too. The sun came out bright and unforgiving the next morning, drying up the last of the rain puddles in front of the church. The roof had leaked again during the storm. Grace could see the brown water stains spreading like bruises along the ceiling beams. It wasn't the first time, but this one was bad enough that Pastor Brooks had finally posted a note on the bulletin board. Volunteers needed for roof repair, tools provided, lunch included. When Grace read it, she smiled a little to herself. She had a feeling she knew someone who might just show up. By 10 o'clock, a handful of men from the congregation had gathered outside the church. Older veterans mostly, good men with bad knees and worn-out caps. They were staring up at the roof, scratching their heads, when the growl of a motorcycle rolled down the street. The sound made them turn in unison. Ryder pulled up in his leather jacket and dusty jeans, a toolbox strapped to the back of his bike. He parked, took off his gloves, and nodded once toward the group. "Morning," he said simply. The men looked at each other, unsure what to say. It was Tommy Carson, the retired vet with a prosthetic leg, who stepped forward first. "We could use a hand," he said, his voice gravelly but friendly. Ryder nodded. "Got 2 good ones." And that was that. From her place inside, the church kitchen, Grace peeked out the window and saw them up on the roof, Ryder, Tommy, and the others, hauling shingles and scraping off old tar. The sight made her chest swell with something she hadn't felt in a while: pride. By noon, the men were sweaty, dusty, and laughing. Grace set out sandwiches and sweet tea under the oak tree out front. When Ryder climbed down to eat, his face was streaked with dirt, his hair damp with sweat. He looked different, lighter somehow. As they sat down to eat, Pastor Brooks joined them. He cleared his throat. "You're new around here," he said, glancing at Ryder's tattooed arms. "Yes, sir," Ryder replied. "Just passing through." The pastor nodded slowly. "Well, every hand helps. We're grateful." Ryder's eyes softened. "Glad to do something that matters." Grace smiled quietly. By late afternoon, the roof was patched, and the men stood back to admire their work. The air smelled of hot tar and fresh shingles. Grace brought out lemonade, and as she handed Ryder a glass, she noticed how tired but peaceful he looked. "You did good work today," she said. He grinned faintly. "Feels good to fix something that stays fixed." She tilted her head. "You fixing roofs now instead of bikes?" He chuckled. "Roofs don't bite back." They stood there for a moment, the golden light catching the dust in the air. Grace could feel it again, that quiet stirring inside her chest whenever he was near. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something deeper, something steady. That evening, after everyone left, Grace stayed to help clean up the church hall. The storm had left mud tracks across the floor, and she was mopping when she heard footsteps behind her. "Need a hand?" Ryder asked. She smiled. "You've already done enough." "Can't leave a lady to finish alone." He took the mop from her gently and started working beside her. They cleaned in easy silence. After a while, he spoke, his voice low. "You ever think people like me don't belong in a place like this?" Grace stopped, looking at him. "I think people like you belong here more than most." He gave her a small smile, but shook his head. "If they knew the things I've done." "Then they'd know the kind of grace you need," she said softly, "and the kind we all need, every day." Something in his expression broke. A wall she hadn't realized was still standing. He looked down at the mop bucket and muttered, "Maybe God sent you to prove that." Grace swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. "Or maybe he sent you to prove it to me." They both laughed a little, and the tension melted. Later that night, the church was quiet. Only the sanctuary light glowed faintly through the stained glass. Grace lingered by the door, watching Ryder stand near the altar. He wasn't praying exactly, just standing still, staring up at the cross like a man trying to remember what peace looked like. Finally, he whispered, "Haven't been in a church in 20 years." Grace stepped beside him. "Then it's about time." He looked at her and smiled softly. "Yeah, feels different. Different good? Different right." They stood there for a moment, the silence warm around them. Then he reached up and gently touched the edge of the wooden cross, his fingers tracing the grain. "You know, my mom used to say this cross don't belong on church walls. She said it belongs on hearts." Grace's eyes glistened. "Sounds like she was right." Ryder nodded. She usually was. The next morning, the news spread fast. The biker helped fix the church roof. People talked again, but this time not in whispers. The sheriff mentioned it at the diner over breakfast. The pastor told it from the pulpit the next Sunday, calling it a lesson in faith through action. Even the regulars who had stopped coming began to drift back in. But as Grace wiped tables that afternoon, a chill of unease rippled through her when she looked out the diner window. A black motorcycle she didn't recognize rolled slowly past. The rider wore a patch she knew too well. Hell's Angels. The man's eyes met hers through the glass, a cold stare that lingered just long enough to make her breath catch. Ryder saw him too from his booth in the corner. His whole body went still. The other rider smirked, revved his engine once, and drove away. Ryder stood up quietly, jaw clenched. "I need to go." Grace's heart thudded. "Who was that?" "An old friend," he said grimly. "Or he used to be." When the door shut behind him, Grace stood frozen, the hum of the diner suddenly too loud. Something had shifted again. The peace of the past few days had cracked. And for the first time, Grace realized that whatever Ryder was running from wasn't finished running after him. The next morning, the air in town felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. Grace noticed it first in the way people looked at her when she stopped by the grocery store. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Smiles were forced. Someone whispered her name, followed by the biker woman. By the time she got to the diner, her stomach was tight with worry. She tried to tell herself it was just nerves, but when she saw the sheriff's car parked out front, her heart sank. Sheriff Dean Weller stood by the door, sipping coffee from a paper cup. "Morning, Grace," he said evenly. "Mind if I talk to you a minute?" She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sure, Sheriff. What's this about?" He hesitated, glancing toward the parking lot. "You seen your friend, the biker, today?" Grace's brow furrowed. "Ryder? No, not since yesterday. Why?" "Because I saw 2 motorcycles pass through town at dawn. Same patch he wears. They didn't stop, but they looked like they were searching for something, or someone." Grace's blood went cold. The sheriff's voice softened. "Grace, I'm not saying he's a bad man, but if he's mixed up with that club, you might be standing too close to a line that can burn you." She swallowed hard. "He's trying to change, Sheriff. He's not like them anymore." Weller sighed. "I hope you're right." He tipped his hat and walked out, leaving her alone with the echo of his words. Ryder came by that afternoon, but he didn't come inside right away. Grace watched from the window as he stood beside his motorcycle, staring out at the desert road. His shoulders looked heavier than usual, his face drawn. She stepped outside, her heart quickening. "Ryder," she called softly. He turned slowly. "You shouldn't be out here." "Why? What's wrong?" He rubbed his face with both hands, then looked at her, his eyes sharp with pain. "That man who rode by the diner yesterday, his name's Axel. He used to be my brother, my second in command. Now he's the one hunting me." "Hunting you?" she whispered. Ryder nodded. "I tried to walk away from the club. After my son was killed in a crossfire between chapters, I wanted out. But nobody walks away clean. They think I sold them out to the feds. They won't stop until I'm either back in or buried." Grace's chest tightened. "And you came here? To my town?" "I didn't mean to drag it here," he said quietly. "I just wanted somewhere quiet. Somewhere I could remember who I used to be before I turned into him." Rain threatened again, dark clouds rolling over the mountains. Grace could smell the damp wind. "You can't face them alone," she said. "I already am," he replied. "Then let me help." He shook his head. "No, you've already done enough. Too much." But Grace stepped closer, voice trembling but firm. "You think helping someone is too much? Ryder, you fixed my truck, my roof, and my faith in people. Let me stand with you." For a long moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, his hard expression softened. "You're the bravest person I've ever met, Grace Miller," he said. "And the kindest." Thunder cracked overhead. That night, Grace closed the diner early. She could feel trouble coming, like electricity in the air. She prayed softly as she wiped down the tables, asking God to keep Ryder safe. But when she stepped outside, her heart nearly stopped. The diner windows were shattered, glass glittering across the porch like frost. Spray-painted across the door in dripping red letters were 2 words: Rat Rider. Grace's hands flew to her mouth. Someone had destroyed her diner, the place she'd poured every ounce of hope into. Tears burned her eyes, but she forced herself to breathe. She ran inside, checking the back door, the register, the kitchen. Everything else was untouched. It wasn't a robbery. It was a message, a cruel one. She called the sheriff, who arrived within minutes, lights flashing red against the broken glass. "You think this was them?" he asked. Grace nodded, her voice shaking. "They're after Ryder, but they wanted me to see it." Weller sighed. "I'll have patrols drive by through the night. You should stay with a friend." "I'm not leaving my diner." He studied her face, then nodded. "All right, but lock the doors. And Grace, be careful." When the sheriff left, Grace sat on the floor among the broken glass. The smell of paint filled the air. She bowed her head and wept quietly, not out of fear but heartbreak. She didn't hear the footsteps at first. Heavy, slow. Then a shadow fell across the doorway. "Grace?" Ryder's voice said softly. She looked up to see him standing there, his face pale, a cut above his eyebrow still bleeding. "What happened to you?" she gasped, rushing toward him. He waved her off. "Axel's men. They caught up to me on the ridge outside town. I sent them off, but..." He touched his ribs and winced. "Didn't leave clean." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "This is because of you," she whispered, not in anger, but in grief. He nodded. "I know. I didn't want this to touch you." She reached for his hand. "Then stop fighting. Go to the police. Let them protect you." He shook his head. "No cops. That'll just get you more trouble." "Ryder," she pleaded, "you can't keep running. Sooner or later they'll find you, and if you don't stand for something now, you'll die with the wrong men thinking they owned your soul." For a long moment, the only sound was the rain beginning to fall again, soft against the cracked glass. Ryder met her eyes, and something changed in his face. A flicker of peace breaking through the storm. "You sound like my mom," he said quietly. "She always told me that a man's soul ain't for sale, no matter who thinks they own it." He squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you, Grace, for reminding me who I was." Then he stepped back toward the door, his voice low. "I'll handle this. But if they come back, don't wait for me. Just run." "Ryder, don't..." But he was already gone, swallowed by the rain and the darkness. Grace stood in the doorway long after he left, rain soaking her hair, her reflection trembling in the shards of glass around her feet. "Lord," she whispered, "don't let him fall before he finds his way home." The thunder rolled again, deep and distant, and somewhere beyond the horizon, engines growled like wolves in the night. The storm that night didn't stop until dawn. It pounded the small town until even the dust washed clean, leaving everything gray and hollow-looking. Grace arrived at the diner early, her hands trembling as she unlocked the door. The Rat Rider graffiti was gone. Someone from the sheriff's office must have scrubbed it off, but the glass still lay in dull, scattered piles along the porch. She swept in silence, the only sound the broom brushing against the floor. Every scrape of glass felt like a piece of her heart breaking all over again. By mid-morning, the phone rang. She wiped her hands on her apron and answered. "Grace Miller?" came the sheriff's voice. "Yes?" "You seen Ryder today?" Her stomach dropped. "No, why? What happened?" He sighed. "We found his bike outside town, abandoned by the riverbank. No sign of him." Grace gripped the counter, her knees weak. "Abandoned? What do you mean?" "No blood, no body, just the bike. Could be he's hiding. Could be worse." Grace closed her eyes, whispering a prayer before she hung up. She wanted to believe he'd left on purpose, that he'd just needed space. But deep down, she knew. Ryder wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. That afternoon, she closed the diner early. The rain had stopped, but the sky still hung low and heavy. She drove out toward the ridge road, past the desert brush and dry riverbeds, until she reached the spot the sheriff had described. The black Harley was there, leaning against a weathered mesquite tree. The seat was torn, and one handlebar bent. A single dog tag dangled from the ignition. Grace's breath caught when she saw the name stamped into the metal, R. Kane. Her fingers closed around it, cold and trembling. Attached to the tag was a small scrap of paper, stained and damp but legible. "You saved me once. Now I have to finish this." That was all it said. Grace pressed the tag to her heart, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Lord," she whispered, "bring him home." She stood there for a long time, the desert wind tugging at her hair, the emptiness around her stretching like eternity. Days passed. Then a week. Ryder didn't return. The sheriff checked in every couple of days, but there was never any news. Rumors began again. Some said he'd gone back to the Hells Angels. Others said he'd been killed and buried out in the desert. A few even claimed he'd been an undercover cop all along. Grace ignored them all. She went to work every day, smiled at customers who looked at her with pity, and prayed each night before bed. Still, loneliness pressed on her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. Linda stopped by often, bringing casseroles and small talk. "You can't keep waiting, Grace," she said gently one evening. "You did your part. Whatever happens now is out of your hands." Grace stared out the window at the fading sunset. "If it were you out there, Linda, if someone you believed in disappeared, you wouldn't stop praying either." Linda sighed. "No, I guess I wouldn't." They hugged before Linda left, and Grace stood by the window long after the headlights disappeared. One night, about 2 weeks later, she dreamed of him. In the dream, Ryder stood beside his motorcycle, the desert wind whipping around him. He looked at her with that same half-smile, but his eyes were clear, peaceful somehow. "Don't stop believing," he said. Grace woke with tears on her cheeks, and the sound of thunder rumbling in the distance. She couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something. The next morning, when she opened the diner, she noticed a small envelope tucked under the door. There was no name, no address. Inside was a photograph. It was of Ryder, standing beside a truck, talking to 2 police officers. He looked tired, but alive. On the back, written in the same blocky handwriting as before, were the words, "It's not over. Keep the light on." Grace pressed the photo to her lips, whispering, "Thank you, Lord." She hung the picture inside her apron pocket, close to her heart, and from that day on, she left a single candle burning in the diner window every night. Not because she was waiting helplessly, but because she believed. The months that followed were quiet. The town slowly moved on. The church roof stayed firm through another storm. Business picked up again, and the whispers finally died down. But Grace never forgot. Every night before locking up, she'd pause by the window and glance at the road, half expecting to hear the rumble of a bike in the distance. And though it never came, something in her heart stayed certain. He was out there, doing what needed to be done. Maybe he was running. Maybe he was fighting. But she knew one thing. He wasn't lost anymore. Late one evening, as the sky turned violet over the desert, Grace walked to the front door to blow out the candle. For a second, she hesitated, looking out at the empty road. Then she whispered softly, "I'll keep it lit until you find your way back." She didn't know that hundreds of miles away, Ryder Kane was sitting in a small motel room, bruised and bleeding, clutching his mother's old Bible in one hand and her photograph in the other. He whispered the same words she had. "I'm coming home." The Arizona sky had already turned to gold when the news came. Grace was refilling salt shakers at the diner counter when Linda burst through the door, breathless and wide-eyed, clutching a folded newspaper. "Grace, you need to see this," she said, waving it in the air. Grace frowned, wiping her hands on a towel. "What is it?" Linda spread the paper flat on the counter, the headline in bold letters across the top. "Hell's Angels leader turns himself in, testifies in federal case." Grace's heart stopped. She scanned the article, her eyes darting across the lines. Ryder Kane, former president of the Hells Angels National Chapter, surrendered to authorities in Phoenix last night. Kane has agreed to testify against multiple members of the gang in exchange for leniency and witness protection. Linda's voice softened. "He did it, Grace. He turned himself in." Grace sat down hard on the stool behind her. Her mind spun, 1,000 thoughts crashing together. Relief, pride, fear. "He's alive," she whispered. "Alive and brave," Linda said. "He's trying to make things right." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She traced Ryder's name on the page with her fingertip, her lips trembling. He kept his word. 3 days later, she drove to Phoenix. It was a long, lonely trip, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. She wore her best dress, a simple blue one that had been hanging in her closet for years, and brought along a small Bible and the dog tag she'd found. The courthouse was busy, filled with reporters and officers. Grace stood in the back of the courtroom, hands clasped tightly in her lap. When Ryder entered wearing a plain shirt and shackles, her breath caught. He looked thinner, older. His hair was shorter, his face lined with exhaustion. But when his eyes found hers across the crowded room, they softened. He smiled. Just a little. But it was enough. The trial began. Grace listened as the prosecutor read off names, charges, and evidence, words that sounded like another language to her. She didn't care about the details. All she cared about was that Ryder had done it. He'd stood up for what was right, even if it meant standing alone. When it was Ryder's turn to speak, the courtroom fell silent. His voice was low but steady. "I ain't proud of the man I was," he said, "but a woman I met showed me something I'd forgotten. What decency looks like. She helped me start my bike, sure, but she also helped me start my soul again." Whispers rippled through the room. The judge glanced up from his notes, studying Ryder quietly. Ryder continued, his hands gripping the table. "I used to think mercy was for other people. Folks better than me. Turns out mercy's for anyone brave enough to ask for it." Grace wiped her eyes, her heart breaking and swelling all at once. When the session ended, the judge called Ryder forward. "Mr. Kane," she said, her tone firm but not unkind, "your cooperation has saved lives and helped deliver justice. That matters. You are sentenced to time served, plus 6 months of rehabilitation under supervision. After that, you'll be free to rebuild your life, if you choose to." Ryder nodded, voice hoarse. "Yes, ma'am." The gavel struck. It was over. When the courtroom cleared, Ryder turned toward Grace. She stepped forward as far as the guards allowed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ryder whispered, "You came." "Of course I did," Grace said softly. "You didn't think I'd miss the ending, did you?" He smiled faintly. "Guess not. You always did believe in me more than I deserved." Grace's eyes glistened. "You just needed someone to remind you who you were." He nodded. "And now I get to find out who I can be." When the guards led him away, Grace placed her hand against the cool glass window of the hallway, watching him go. She whispered a quiet prayer, not for his freedom, but for his peace. Outside, the air was warm and bright. Grace sat on the courthouse steps for a long time, letting the sun soak into her skin. For the first time in years, she felt completely still. No fear, no doubt, just quiet hope. Linda called her later that evening. "How did it go?" Grace smiled faintly. "It went how it was supposed to. He's free, Linda, really free." "That's a miracle," Linda said. Grace looked up at the evening sky, the first star flickering into view. "It's Grace," she whispered. "Same thing, really." The next morning she woke early, made coffee, and opened her Bible. The verse she turned to read. "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come." She closed the book and smiled. Ryder's story wasn't over. And neither was hers. Weeks later, Grace received a letter in the mail. It had no return address, but she knew the handwriting. "Grace, you told me to stand for something. I did. I stood for the truth. And for you. They're sending me to a program out of state for a few months, but when I'm through, I'm coming home. If you'll still have me around, I'd like to wash dishes at that diner of yours. Seems fitting. You saved my life. Maybe I can help you keep yours running smooth for a while. Keep the light on." Ryder Grace pressed the letter to her chest and laughed through her tears. Outside her window, the desert wind stirred gently, carrying the scent of dust and rain. And somewhere far away, a man who once led a gang now walked free. Not by escape, but by redemption. The diner smelled like fresh paint and hope. 2 weeks after Ryder's trial, Grace stood outside, watching as volunteers from the church hammered the final nails into the repaired window frames. The place looked brand new. Bright blue trim, clean white walls, and a new sign that read, "Grace's Diner." Inside, Linda arranged flowers on every table. "You sure you don't want to call it something fancier?" she asked with a grin. Grace laughed softly. "Simple is enough. It's who I am." Business had begun to return. Locals who once whispered now smiled when they came in, quietly placing generous tips on the counter. Even the sheriff stopped by every morning for pie, nodding respectfully. The fear that had once hung over the town seemed to have melted, replaced by something gentler, understanding. In the evenings, Grace would sit by the window, the candle burning in its usual place. Some nights she still heard the faint echo of a motorcycle in the distance, though she never knew if it was real or just her heart remembering. She no longer felt lost waiting. Instead, she felt steady, grateful. The diner had been broken, just like her, but both had been rebuilt with love, kindness, and faith. Grace smiled as she turned off the lights and whispered to the empty room, "The door's open, Ryder. Whenever you're ready." The wind outside rattled the bell above the door gently, almost like an answer. Autumn came quietly to the desert. The air grew cooler, the sunsets deeper, and golden leaves gathered along the roadside near the diner. Grace was refilling the sugar jars one morning when the familiar rumble reached her ears. It was faint at first, like an echo from another life. But as it drew closer, Her heart began to race. The bell over the door jingled softly. A man stepped inside. He wasn't in leather this time, just worn jeans, a plain gray shirt, and that same quiet strength in his eyes. "Morning," Ryder said, his voice rough but warm. Grace froze for a heartbeat, then smiled so wide it hurt. "You came back." He nodded. "Told you I would. Got out last week. Thought I'd start earning that dishwashing job you promised." She laughed through her tears. "I did say that, didn't I?" The other diners turned to look, but there was no fear this time, only quiet curiosity. Grace handed him an apron, and he tied it clumsily around his waist. "Haven't worn one of these before," he said. "You'll get used to it." That day, Ryder washed dishes and swept floors. He joked with customers, and even fixed the jukebox that hadn't worked in years. When closing time came, he joined Grace on the porch, the desert bathed in orange light. "I didn't think I'd ever have a place that felt like home again," he said. "You do now," she replied softly. He looked out at the road, peaceful for once. "You know, Grace, you saved me." She shook her head. "No, Ryder. You just needed someone to remind you where to start." They sat in silence as the first stars appeared. Two souls finally at rest, surrounded by the simple music of crickets and wind. Winter came softly to the Arizona desert that year. Mornings were cool and bright, the mountains bathed in soft gold light, and every evening the horizon burned crimson before fading to silver. Grace stood outside her little diner, newly renamed Grace and Grit Cafe, and smiled at the hand-painted sign swinging in the morning wind. The name said everything. Grace for the woman who never stopped believing, and grit for the man who found his redemption through kindness. Inside, the cafe buzzed with quiet joy. The smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls filled the air. Veterans gathered at their favorite booth, talking about old days and new hopes. Families came in for breakfast after church. Even travelers stopped along the highway, drawn by the warm glow of the lights and the reputation that had spread far beyond the small town. The cafe built on second chances. Behind the counter, Ryder worked like he belonged there. His hands, once scarred and restless, now moved with steady rhythm as he wiped down counters and carried trays. He'd traded his leather jacket for a soft flannel shirt, his scowl for a quiet smile. When people asked how long he'd been cooking, he'd just grin and say, "Long enough to know eggs wait for no man." The town had learned to trust him again, slowly but fully. Even Pastor Brooks stopped by each morning for coffee, and the sheriff had become a regular. Grace watched him now as he laughed with Linda near the register, his shoulders easy, his spirit light. She thought about how far they'd come, from that dusty road where she first found him stranded, to this warm, peaceful place they'd built together. The memory filled her with gratitude so deep it ached. "You keep staring," Ryder teased, catching her eye. "I'm starting to think you like having me around." Grace chuckled. "I guess I do. The dishes don't wash themselves." He grinned, leaning on the counter. "You've changed too, you know." "Oh?" she said, raising a brow. "Yeah," he replied softly. "You look happy." She smiled, her eyes misting. "That's because I am." Outside, the sun dipped lower, spreading gold across the desert. Grace lit the candle that still sat by the window, a habit she'd never given up. It had once been a symbol of waiting, then of prayer, and now of thanksgiving. Its small flame flickered against the glass, steady and sure. Ryder came up beside her, drying his hands. "Still keeping that flame going?" "Always," Grace said. "It reminds me that hope doesn't die. It just waits for someone brave enough to believe in it." He looked out at the quiet road. "Then I guess we both learned something." A pickup truck rolled to a stop outside. A tired mother stepped out, holding the hands of 2 sleepy children. "You still open?" she called, her voice uncertain. Grace smiled, pushing open the door wide. "Always." Ryder held the door for them, and the warm light spilled out into the cold. Inside, laughter stirred again, gentle and real. Grace poured hot cocoa for the kids, and Ryder brought out biscuits from the oven. The woman's eyes filled with relief as she whispered, "Thank you." Grace just smiled. "That's what we do here." When the family was settled, she looked out at the candle flickering in the window. Beyond the glow, the stars had begun to appear, bright, endless, and full of promise. She whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for bringing us home." And there it was, the truth she'd always known deep down. Home wasn't the diner or the town, or even the name on the sign. Home was the peace that came when hearts healed and hope returned. Home was grace and grit. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.